Close your eyes and imagine a world where the sun was the only clock. A world where noon was different in every town you passed, and the vast, untamed heart of the American continent was a silent mystery of swaying grass and ancient stone. Before the roar of the engines, there was a quiet so deep it felt eternal. This is the story of how a single line of iron stitched a divided land together, and how the rhythmic click-clack of the rails eventually lulled a nation into a new era of time.
In the early 1800s, the United States was a collection of distant echoes. If you stood on the docks of New York City, the idea of the California coast wasn't just a distance, it was a different life, months of treacherous travel away. The air in the east was thick with the scent of sea salt and coal smoke, while the west remained a canvas of golden hues and silhouettes of the Sierra Nevada. History often remembers the loud moments, the battles, the speeches, the triumphs, but the history of the Great Expansion is best understood in the quiet details. It begins with the surveyors. These were men of immense patience, carrying brass theodolites and heavy chains across landscapes that had never seen a straight line. Imagine a surveyor named Elias standing in the middle of what we now call Nebraska. It is 1862. The wind moves through the tall grass prairie like waves on an ocean. There is no sound but the rustle of the dry stalks and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above. Elias is not looking for gold, he is looking for the grade. He is looking for a path where a heavy steam engine can climb without losing its breath. The task was statistically impossible. To connect the Atlantic to the Pacific, they had to lay over 1,900 miles of track. But the beauty lay in the monotony. The workers, thousands of Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and later the incredibly hard-working Chinese laborers, moved with a rhythmic precision that was almost hypnotic. Each rail was 30 feet long. Each rail required 3 strokes of a heavy sledgehammer to secure the spikes. Clang, clang, clang. This became the heartbeat of the continent. If you were to sit on a hill miles away, the sound would reach you as a faint metallic pulse, a steady reminder that the world was becoming smaller, one spike at a time. As the Union Pacific pushed west from Omaha and the Central Pacific pushed east from Sacramento, they weren't just building a road, they were redefining the American atmosphere. They moved through the Platte River Valley, a place so flat and wide that the horizon seemed to melt into the sky. The light here at dusk turns a deep, dusty purple. The laborers would sit by their campfires, the smell of cedar wood smoke drifting into the cool night air, staring at stars that seemed bright enough to touch. In these camps there was a specific kind of silence. After 12 hours of physical labor, the men didn't speak much. They listened to the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. They were tired in a way that modern people rarely experience, a deep skeletal exhaustion that made the hard ground feel as soft as a feather bed. To understand why this history is so calming, one must look at the machines themselves. The 19th century steam locomotive was a masterpiece of steady pressure. It wasn't the frantic, high-pitched whine of a modern jet. It was a low, guttural huffing. Inside the boiler, water turned to steam, a process of transformation as old as the earth. The engineers treated their engines like living creatures. They called them iron horses, but they were more like giant breathing lungs.
The heat from the firebox radiated a gentle, consistent warmth. For the engineers sitting in the cab, the world passed by at 20 miles per hour. At 20 miles per hour, you see everything. You see the way the dew clings to the sagebrush in the Great Basin. You see the different shades of red in the rocks of Echo Canyon. You notice the transition from the humid air of the Missouri River to the thin, crisp, pine-scented air of the Rocky Mountains. The technical specifications of these engines are a lullaby of numbers. The 440 American-type locomotive had 4 leading wheels, 4 driving wheels, and 0 trailing wheels. It carried roughly 2,000 gallons of water and 6 tons of wood. These numbers represented a balance, a perfect equilibrium required to cross a desert where water was more precious than gold. As the train moved, the pistons moved back and forth, back and forth. This reciprocating motion created a vibration that settled into the bones of the passengers. For the first time in history, Americans were being rocked to sleep by the movement of progress. Before the railroad reached its peak, time was a local concept. Each town set its clock by the sun. When the sun was at its highest point, it was noon. This meant that when it was 12 p.m. in Chicago, it might be 12:12 p.m. in Detroit and 11:50 a.m. in St. Louis. There were over 300 different local times in the United States. Imagine the confusion, but also the slowness of it. There was no rush. You lived by your town's clock. The sun dictated the rhythm of your day. But for the railroad, this was a logistical nightmare. A train leaving at 9 a.m. from one station might arrive at the next station before it had even left, according to the local dial. The solution came from a man named William F. Allen. He proposed the Standard Time System. On November 18, 1883, a day known as the Day of Two Noons, the railroad companies synchronized their watches. In every major city, at the stroke of noon, the clocks were held still for a few minutes or jumped forward, bringing the entire nation into 4 beautiful, organized time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. This change was invisible, yet it changed the soul of the country. Suddenly, the ticking of a clock in New York was in harmony with a clock in Florida. The entire nation began to breathe in sync. The frantic mess of hundreds of local sundials settled into a quiet, orderly march of minutes and seconds. While the Union Pacific was moving across the flat, dusty plains of Nebraska, the Central Pacific was facing a wall of ancient, stubborn granite, the Sierra Nevada. To the average traveler today, these mountains are a scenic backdrop, but in 1866 they were a silent, frozen fortress. If you were to stand at the base of Summit Tunnel, otherwise known as Tunnel Number 6, you would hear a sound that defined this era, the rhythmic, metallic tink, tink, tink of a hand drill hitting solid rock. This wasn't a fast process. It was a meditation in stone. 2 men would work together. One would hold a long iron drill, while the other swung a heavy sledgehammer. After every strike, the man holding the drill would rotate it slightly, just a few degrees. Strike, rotate, strike, rotate. This became the double jack method. It took hours of back-breaking, synchronized movement just to drill a hole deep enough for a single blast of black powder. On a good day, the teams might only progress 7 or 8 inches. Imagine the patience required to look at a mountain of solid granite and decide to move through it 8 inches at a time. The air at 7,000 feet was thin and cold, scented with the sharp fragrance of pine needles and the cold metallic smell of wet stone.
The silence of the high Sierras was so heavy that the sound of the hammers would echo for miles, bouncing off the peaks like the heartbeat of the mountain itself.
The Chinese laborers, who made up the majority of this workforce, brought a specific kind of calm to the chaos. While other workers might grow frustrated by the slow pace, the Chinese teams organized themselves with surgical precision. They lived in small, neat camps. They drank boiled tea, a habit that kept them healthy, while other camps suffered from dysentery. The smell of jasmine and green tea would waft through the freezing mountain air, a gentle contrast to the harsh gray world of the granite cliffs. The winters in the Sierras were not merely cold, they were legendary. The snow didn't just fall, it accumulated in drifts 40 feet high. Entire camps were buried. To keep working, the men lived under the snow, carving out white frozen tunnels to travel between their bunkhouses and the rock face. In this subterranean world, the world went completely silent. Snow is a natural acoustic insulator. Under 30 feet of pack, the wind stopped howling. The only sound was the muffled thud of a shovel and the soft breathing of men in the dim lantern light. To protect the tracks from being swept away by avalanches, the engineers designed snowsheds. These were massive wooden galleries, essentially indoor miles of track built from heavy timber. Imagine a wooden tunnel, miles long, snaking through the mountains. When a train passed through these sheds, the world changed. The bright, blinding white of the snow disappeared, replaced by the amber glow of lanterns and the smell of cured wood and coal smoke. It was a cathedral of timber. For the passengers, it was a moment of deep, rhythmic transit, the sound of the wheels echoing off the wooden walls in a steady, hypnotic drone. Thrum, 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 thrum. It was a cradle of wood in a world of ice. In the quietest part of the construction, a new substance arrived that changed everything: nitroglycerin. Before this, they used black powder, which was slow and predictable. Nitroglycerin was different. It was a clear, oily liquid that was terrifyingly sensitive. The chemists who handled it moved with the grace of a tightrope walker. They had to keep the liquid cool. They had to pour it into the hand-drilled holes with hands that never shook. In the history of the railroad, this is a chapter of extreme focus. Think of a chemist in 1867 standing in a dark tunnel, the only light coming from a flickering candle. He holds a glass vial of blasting oil. The world around him is damp and silent. He knows that a single drop spilled or a sudden jar could end everything. The level of concentration required created a workplace that was strangely quiet. No one shouted, no one ran. Everyone moved in a slow, deliberate dance of safety. When the blasts finally occurred, they weren't like the explosions in movies. In the deep tunnels, a blast was a physical pressure, a low-frequency thump that you felt in your chest more than you heard in your ears. It was followed by the sound of crumbling stone, and then, once again, the return of the deep mountain silence. Once the tracks broke through the Sierra Nevada, they descended into the Great Basin, a vast, high-altitude desert that covers most of Nevada. Here, the challenge wasn't rock, it was the void. The Great Basin is a place of incredible horizontal beauty. It is a land of sagebrush, salt flats, and dust devils that dance across the horizon. The colors here are muted: silver greens, pale tans, and the shimmering white of dried alkaline lakes. The railroad crews here moved faster. They were laying 2, 3, sometimes even 10 miles of track in a single day. This was the great race. But even in the race, there was a rhythm. Imagine the iron car, a horse-drawn carriage that carried the rails to the end of the track. 2 men would grab the front of a rail.
They would pull it forward. Clunk, it hit the ties. The gaugers would check the width. The spikers would step forward. Bang, bang, bang. They did this thousands of times a day. The workers became a human machine. If you watched them from a distance, they looked like a long blue-clad serpent moving across the desert floor. The sun would beat down, the heat shimmering off the iron, creating mirages of water where there was only dry sand. At night, the desert temperature would plummet. The iron rails, which had expanded in the heat of the day, would begin to cool. If you laid your ear near the track at midnight in the Nevada desert, you could hear the singing of the rails, a series of high-pitched pings and groans as the metal contracted. It was the sound of the Earth's temperature written in iron.
In the desert, the most important structure wasn't the station or the saloon, it was the water tank. Every 20 miles or so, a tall wooden tower stood alone against the sky. Steam engines are thirsty. They turn water into power, and in the desert, water is a miracle. These tanks were often built from redwood or cedar. They were held together by massive iron hoops. There is something deeply peaceful about a railroad water tank. You can hear the gentle slosh of the water inside as the wind shakes the tower. You can hear the drip, drip, drip of a small leak hitting the dry earth below, creating a tiny accidental oasis of green weeds in a sea of brown dust. When the train stopped to take on water, the world paused. The engineer would pull a heavy chain, and a large spout would swing down. The sound of hundreds of gallons of water rushing into the locomotive's tender was like a private waterfall in the middle of the wasteland. For 10 minutes, the steam hissed softly. The passengers stretched their legs, and the only sound was the liquid rushing into the iron belly of the beast. It was a moment of refueling, not just for the machine, but for the soul of the journey. By the spring of 1869, the gap between the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific had narrowed to a few miles of dusty Utah soil. The place was Promontory Summit, a high, wind-swept basin surrounded by the silent purple shadows of the mountains. On May 10th, the atmosphere was not of loud celebration, but of profound, heavy anticipation. 2 engines, the Union Pacific No. 119 and the Central Pacific's Jupiter, pulled up nose to nose. They were so close that the heat from their boilers warmed the faces of the engineers looking out from the opposite cabs. Think of the golden spike. In history books, it's a flash of gold and a loud cheer, but in reality, it was a moment of technical delicacy. The spike was made of 17.6 karat gold, a soft, heavy metal. It was a symbol of the immense wealth and the immense cost of this project. Beside it were 3 other spikes, one of silver, one of gold and silver, and one of iron plated with silver. The silence that fell over the crowd as the final spike was placed was the most important part of the day. For the first time in human history, a person could travel from New York to San Francisco in a week instead of 6 months. The continent had been physically sewn together. As the hammer struck the spike, a telegraph wire was attached to it. Every time the hammer hit the metal, the click was sent instantly across the nation's telegraph lines. In Washington, D.C., in Chicago, in New Orleans, people gathered around telegraph offices, listening to the rhythmic click, click, click of a hammer thousands of miles away. It was the first live media event in American history, but it was told in the simplest of sounds. With the rails connected, the focus shifted from the construction to the experience. This is where the American history of calm truly begins.
Before the railroad, travel was a jarring, bone-shaking ordeal in a stagecoach. After 1869, it became an exercise in luxury and stillness. Enter George Pullman. He didn't just build train cars, he built palaces on wheels. Imagine stepping onto a Pullman car in 1875. The interior was a sanctuary of dark, polished walnut, plush crimson velvet, and thick, heavy carpets that swallowed the sound of footsteps. The windows were made of double-paned glass to keep out the dust of the prairies. The most fascinating part was the transformation at night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the porter, often a man of great dignity and quiet efficiency, would move through the car. With a series of practiced rhythmic motions, he would pull down the upper berths and fold the seats into lower beds. He would button the heavy damask curtains closed, creating a private, soft-walled cocoon for every passenger. The scent inside was a mixture of lavender-scented linens and the faint ozonic smell of the night air outside. As the train rolled across the flat expanses of Kansas or Iowa, the passengers would lie in these beds, feeling the gentle side-to-side sway, the Pullman rock. There is a specific frequency to a train's movement. It mimics the heartbeat of a mother. For generations of Americans, the railroad became the ultimate sleeping machine. You weren't just traveling, you were being held by the machine as it glided through the darkness. If the sleeping car was the soul of the train, the dining car was its heart. Before the 1880s, trains would stop at eating houses along the tracks. These were often frantic, dusty places where you had 20 minutes to eat a tough piece of meat before the whistle blew. But the dining car changed the pace of the day. Imagine sitting at a table covered in a white linen cloth so heavy it didn't wrinkle. The silverware was real silver, bearing the crest of the railroad. The plates were thick, heavy china. The menu was an atlas of American flavors. As you passed through the Chesapeake Bay area, you might be served fresh oysters. As you crossed the Mississippi, perhaps a perfectly flaky catfish. In the West, buffalo steaks or mountain trout. The miracle was the kitchen. It was a space no larger than a modern walk-in closet, yet 3 or 4 chefs worked there in a synchronized ballet. They managed wood-burning stoves and ice chests, while the train leaned into curves at 40 miles per hour. They moved with the sway, never spilling a drop of coffee, never breaking an egg. The sound in the dining car was a sophisticated hum, the clinking of crystal, the low murmur of conversation, and the steady shh of the wheels on the steel rails below. It was a place where time didn't matter. You could sit for hours watching the American landscape unfold like a slow-moving movie. At the very back of the great transcontinental trains was the observation platform. This was a small open-air balcony with a brass railing. For the American traveler, this was the most hypnotic place on earth. You would sit in a wicker chair, protected from the wind by the bulk of the train, and watch the tracks. The 2 iron rails would emerge from beneath you and stretch out towards the horizon, eventually meeting at a single point in the distance. In the late afternoon, the shadows of the telegraph poles would stretch long and thin across the grass. You could see the ghost towns of the frontier, small clusters of wooden shacks that had been bustling cities during the construction, now silent and reclaiming their peace. The smell on the observation deck was the smell of the continent itself. In the east, it was the damp, green scent of deciduous forests. In the Midwest, the heavy, sweet aroma of cornfields and turned earth. In the west, the sharp, dry tang of sagebrush and the electric scent of a distant thunderstorm. Watching the tracks was a lesson in perspective. You saw where you had been, but never where you were going. It forced a sense of presence, a realization that the journey was not about the destination, but about the transition, the slow, steady glide through the heart of the world. While the trains provided the movement, Fred Harvey provided the grace. Along the Santa Fe Railroad, he opened Harvey houses. These weren't just restaurants, they were outposts of civilization in the wild. The Harvey girls were young women who came from the East looking for adventure and a respectable living. They wore crisp black and white uniforms that were kept impeccably clean despite the desert dust. They operated with a silent code. A passenger would order their drink on the train, and the conductor would telegraph the order ahead. By the time the passenger sat down at the Harvey house, their cup of coffee was already waiting for them, steaming and perfect. The Harvey houses introduced a level of quiet decorum to the West. There was no shouting, no rowdiness. The floors were polished marble or tile. The air was cool, kept fresh by thick adobe walls and ceiling fans that spun with a lazy, hypnotic thwack, thwack, thwack. This was the boring history at its best. Not a history of wars, but a history of how a hot cup of coffee and a clean tablecloth could tame a wild land more effectively than any army. To the modern ear, a train whistle is a loud, perhaps even jarring sound. But in the late 19th century, the whistle was a musical instrument, a deeply soulful voice that echoed through the American wilderness. It was the only sound that could travel for miles, crossing valleys and reaching into the deepest parts of the Appalachian forests or across the wide, empty basins of the West. Engineers took great pride in their whistles. Many would tune their whistles by placing small pieces of wood or metal inside the bells to create a unique signature sound. This was known as quilling. A skilled engineer could make a 5-ton locomotive moan like a lonesome dove or scream like a hawk. In small towns, the whistle was the town's heartbeat. Farmers in their fields didn't need to look at a watch. They knew by the specific low moan of the 402 Express that it was time to head home for supper. The sound followed a physical law called the Doppler effect. As the train approached, the pitch would rise, and as it passed, it would drop into a long, fading sigh. This sigh was the sound of the world moving on. It was a reminder that while you were standing still, the rest of the continent was in a state of graceful, constant flow. At night, hearing a distant whistle from a warm bedroom was the ultimate lullaby. It was a sound that said, the world is still connected, the tracks are still clear, and everything is moving exactly as it should. Running parallel to every mile of iron track was a line of wooden poles connected by a single thin copper wire. This was the telegraph. If the railroad was the body of America, the telegraph was its nervous system. There is a specific, quiet beauty to telegraph poles. They marched across the landscape with a mathematical regularity, usually 30 to 40 poles per mile. If you were a passenger looking out the window, the poles created a rhythmic visual flicker against the horizon, a metronome for your journey. But the most peaceful part of the telegraph was the sound it made in the wind. The wires, stretched tight between the glass insulators, would vibrate. On a quiet, breezy day in the plains, if you stood near a pole, you could hear the aeolian hum, a low, ghostly singing of the wires.
It sounded like 1,000 distant violins playing a single, unending note. Inside the small-town depots, the telegraph key provided the counterpoint. It was a steady, rhythmic click-clack, click-clack. This was the sound of information traveling at the speed of light, a birth announcement in Maine reaching a grandfather in California in the matter of minutes. The telegraph operators, often young men or women with incredible focus, sat in their quiet offices, translating these clicks into human stories. The sound of the key was the sound of 1,000 lives intersecting in a small wooden room, scented with the smell of ink and old paper. The American Railroad Depot was a unique architectural space designed for the art of waiting. Whether it was a grand stone terminal in Chicago or a simple wooden shack in a Kansas flag stop, the depot had a specific atmosphere. Inside, the air was usually still. The floors were heavy oak planks, worn smooth and dark by decades of boots. There was always a large cast-iron pot-belly stove in the center of the room, radiating a dry, dusty warmth in the winter. The most important object in the room was the regulator clock. These were massive, pendulum-driven clocks that were synchronized every morning to the exact second. The tick-tock of the depot clock was the loudest sound in the room. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, tick-tock, tick-tock. It gave the act of waiting a sense of dignity. In the depot, you didn't rush. You sat on a long, curved wooden bench. You watched the dust motes dance in the shafts of sunlight coming through the high windows. You smelled the faint aroma of creosote used to preserve the railroad ties and the sweet, heavy scent of pipe tobacco. It was a place where hurry had no meaning because the train would come when the rails said it would come and not a moment sooner.
We often think of the railroad as just the tracks, but the foundation, the ballast, is where the true engineering silence lies. Ballast is the layer of crushed stone that the wooden ties sit upon. These stones aren't just any rocks, they are jagged, angular pieces of granite or limestone. Their job is to lock together, providing a stable but flexible bed for the thousands of tons of steel that pass over them. When a train moves over the ballast, the stones shift ever so slightly. They breathe. This tiny movement absorbs the vibration of the engine, turning a violent mechanical force into a soft, rhythmic hum. If you walk along a quiet stretch of track today, the ballast is a garden of textures. You see the gray of the stone, the silver weathered wood of the ties, and the rust orange of the iron. In the summer, the stones hold the heat of the sun long after it sets, radiating a gentle warmth back into the cooling night air. It is a masterpiece of passive engineering, a bed of stone that allows a giant of iron to glide as smoothly as a boat on water. At the end of a long division, usually about 100 miles, the locomotive needed to rest. This happened in the roundhouse, a massive, cool, circular building with a turntable in the center. The roundhouse was the most sacred space in the railroad world. It was dim, cool, and filled with the scent of oil, steam, and cold ash. When an engine entered the roundhouse, it was like a giant animal returning to its den. The hostler, the man responsible for moving the engines within the yard, would gently guide the locomotive onto the turntable. With a slow, creaking groan, the entire 100-ton machine would be rotated until it lined up with its specific stall. Inside the stall, the fire was allowed to die down to a low orange glow. The steam pressure would slowly drop. You could hear the engine settling, the metal contracting with soft tinks and clicks. It was the sound of a machine going to sleep. The mechanics would move quietly around it, wiping down the brass fittings and oiling the massive driving rods. In the roundhouse there was no clatter, only the sound of dripping water and the low murmur of men who respected the power of the machines they tended. It was the quietest place in the industrial world. In many small American towns, the express trains were too fast to stop. They had places to be and schedules to keep, but the mail still had to be delivered. This led to one of the most fascinating quiet inventions in history, the mail hook. As the train sped toward a small town at 60 miles per hour, a postal clerk would slide open the heavy side door of the mail car. He would swing out a large iron catcher arm. On the side of the track, the town's postmaster would hang a heavy canvas bag of mail on a tall gallows-like crane. Snap! In a fraction of a second, the arm would snatch the bag from the crane. Simultaneously, the clerk would kick the town's incoming mail bag out onto a soft pile of gravel. The beauty of this was the efficiency. The train didn't slow down. The town didn't stop. The exchange happened in a heartbeat, a physical handshake between the moving and the stationary. To the people in the town, the mail grab was a daily ritual, a flash of steel, a puff of dust, and the return of the deep rural silence. It was a reminder that even in the most remote corner of the country, you were part of the great American flow. One of the most atmospheric moments in the history of American rail travel occurred in the middle of the night when the rest of the world was tucked away in sleep. This was the crossing of the great rivers, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, and the Hudson. As the Midnight Express approached a bridge, the sound of the journey changed completely. On the open prairie, the sound was a soft, rhythmic thrum, but as the wheels left the solid earth and stepped onto the iron girders of a massive bridge, the acoustics transformed. The sound became hollow, deep, and resonant. It was a low-frequency rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and into the pillows of the sleeping passengers. Imagine looking out a window of a darkened Pullman car at 2 a.m. You see the reflection of the train's lights dancing on the black, swirling water of the Mississippi. The bridge itself, a masterpiece of Victorian trusses and rivets, would pass by like a skeletal ghost. Each iron beam would cut the moonlight, creating a flickering strobe effect. Clank, clump, clank, clump. The rhythm of the bridge was slower and heavier than the rhythm of the rails. It felt as though the train was catching its breath, stepping carefully across the watery divide. To the engineer, the bridge was a place of extreme focus. He would lean out of the cab, the cool, damp river air hitting his face, listening to the engine's echo off the steel beams. It was a private symphony of iron and water played out in the deep silence of the American night. As the 20th century dawned, the railroad didn't just connect small towns, it built massive stone monuments in the heart of the great cities. These were the grand terminals. Take a moment to visualize the original Pennsylvania station in New York City, completed in 1910. It was modeled after the Roman baths of Caracalla. It was a structure of pink granite and travertine marble, with ceilings that reached 150 feet into the air.
When you stepped off a dusty train from a 3-day journey from the west, you didn't just walk into a city, you walked into a cathedral. The scale of the room was designed to make the human ego feel small and quiet. Because the ceilings were so high, the thousands of voices, the clicking of heels on marble, and the announcements of the conductors didn't create a noise. Instead, they merged into a single golden hum, a background vibration that sounded like the ocean inside a seashell. In Grand Central Terminal, the ceiling was painted with a map of the stars, a celestial zodiac in gold leaf and cerulean blue. Passengers would look up, paused in their tracks, momentarily forgetting the rush of the city. The light in these stations was always soft, filtered through massive arched windows and dimmed by the dust of 1,000 journeys. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, even as the clocks on the marble walls ticked forward with unwavering precision. In these grand palaces of stone, a specific group of men provided the grace of the journey, the redcaps. These were the porters who met you at the curb or the platform. The redcap was a master of the invisible service. He would take your heavy leather trunks and suitcases piled high on a brass-wheeled trolley and navigate the crowds with a silent, fluid grace. He knew the layout of the station like the back of his hand, the secret elevators, the shortcuts through the baggage rooms, the exact location of every platform. There was a quiet etiquette to the redcap's work. He didn't shout, he didn't rush. He moved with a steady, reliable pace that lowered the stress of the traveler. The sound of the trolley's rubber wheels on the smooth marble floor was a comforting, low-pitched squeak. In an era before plastic wheels and nylon bags, luggage was made of wood, iron, and heavy cowhide. It had weight, it had history. When a redcap placed your bags in your private compartment, there was a sense of finality. The journey had officially begun. The weight was off your shoulders, both literally and figuratively.
In the darkness of the railroad yards, communication was a language of light. Long before the era of digital screens, the safety of thousands of passengers rested on the glow of kerosene lanterns. A railroad lantern was a sturdy, beautiful object. It had a wire cage to protect the glass globe and a heavy base to keep it from tipping over in the wind. The colors, red, green, and amber, were not just signals. They were the punctuation marks of the night. Imagine a signalman standing at a lonely junction in the mountains of Pennsylvania. It is a foggy autumn night. The air smells of wet leaves and coal smoke. He swings his lantern in a wide, slow arc. This is the highball signal, the sign that the track is clear and the train can proceed at full speed. The light from the lantern would catch the fog, creating a soft, glowing orb of color that seemed to float in the air. For the engineer in the approaching locomotive, seeing that steady green light was a moment of profound peace. It meant that someone was watching over him, that the path ahead was safe, and that he could let the engine's rhythm continue undisturbed. The lantern was a lighthouse in a sea of iron, a small flickering flame that kept the vast machine of the railroad in perfect, quiet order. By the 1940s, a new sound began to appear on the American tracks, the low, steady drone of the diesel-electric locomotive. The steam engine was an emotional machine. It puffed, it hissed, it groaned. But the diesel was a mathematical machine. It didn't breathe, it hummed.
It was powered by a massive internal combustion engine that turned a generator, which in turn powered electric motors on the axles. This transition changed the soundscape of the American countryside. The sudden violent blasts of steam were replaced by a consistent, vibrating roar that could be heard for miles. While some missed the romanticism of the steam era, the diesel brought a new kind of calm, reliability. The diesel engines didn't need to stop for water every 20 miles. They didn't need a massive crew to shovel coal. They could pull longer trains over higher mountains with a steady, unwavering strength. Inside the passenger cars, the vibration of the diesel was different. It was a high-frequency zing that settled into the seat cushions. It felt modern. It felt smooth. It was the sound of a country moving into the mid-century, a time of streamlined designs, stainless steel cars, and the super chief flying across the desert like a silver arrow. No history of the American railroad is complete without the quiet, often forgotten story of the hobo. These were the travelers of the under-railroad, men, sometimes women, who moved through the country in the shadows of the freight cars. The life of a hobo was a life of extreme stillness and sudden movement. They lived in jungles, small camps hidden in the brush near the switching yards. There they would cook mulligan stew over a small smokeless fire, listening to the sounds of the yard to know when a westbound was forming. When they caught a ride, they would sit in the open door of an empty boxcar. Imagine the view, the entire American continent passing by without a filter. No glass windows, no velvet curtains, just the wind, the sun, and the blur of the telegraph poles. There was a specific peace in the empty. The boxcar would bounce and sway, the wooden walls creaking like an old ship. The hobo would watch the sun set over the Rockies or the moon rise over the cornfields of Iowa, possessing a view that even the wealthiest passenger in the Pullman car couldn't see. It was a life of radical simplicity, defined by the rhythm of the rails and the search for the next quiet jungle. As the 1930s turned into the 1940s, the look of the American railroad underwent a radical aesthetic shift. The era of heavy, soot-stained black iron gave way to the era of shimmering stainless steel. These were the streamliners. The most famous of these was the Pioneer Zephyr. It didn't look like a traditional train. It looked like a drop of mercury sliding across a glass table. It was made of corrugated shot-weld stainless steel, which caught the light of the morning sun and reflected the colors of the prairie like a mirror. When a streamliner moved through a curve, it didn't lean with a jerky mechanical struggle. Because of its articulated design, where two cars shared a single set of wheels, the train moved like a serpent. If you were standing at the front of the train looking back during a long sweeping turn in the Colorado canyons, you would see a continuous, unbroken line of silver, gracefully bending with the earth. The sound of the streamliner was a sophisticated, muted hum. The windows were sealed, the air was conditioned, a true luxury at the time, and the outside world became a silent, high-definition painting. You could watch a herd of pronghorn antelope racing the train across the Wyoming flats, their hooves kicking up dust in total silence, while you sat inside sipping a cold glass of iced tea in a climate-controlled sanctuary. In 1945, the Burlington Railroad introduced something that changed the way Americans saw their own country, the Vista Dome. Imagine a passenger car with a second story made almost entirely of thick, heat-resistant glass. You would climb a short flight of carpeted stairs and find yourself sitting above the roofline of the train. For the traveler, the Vista Dome was the ultimate place of meditation. You weren't just looking out a side window, you had a 360-degree view of the world. In the Pacific Northwest, this meant you could look straight up at the towering Douglas firs and western red cedars that lined the tracks. In the desert, it meant you could see the entire dome of the Milky Way at night, stretching from horizon to horizon, undisturbed by city lights. There is a specific kind of peace found in a Vista Dome at midnight. The car is dark, save for the faint glow of the floor lights. The only sound is the soft whoosh of the wind over the glass canopy. You feel as though you are floating through the landscape, a silent observer of the sleeping continent. You see the lonely lights of distant farmhouses, the green glow of a signal tower, and the occasional flash of a car's headlights on a parallel highway, all while being cradled in a bubble of glass and steel. In the great long-distance trains, like the Santa Fe Super Chief or the Pennsylvania Railroad's Broadway Limited, there was often a dedicated library car. This was a space designed for total silence. The walls were lined with leather-bound books and the latest newspapers from every major city along the route. The chairs were deep, overstuffed wingbacks covered in mohair or soft leather. The library car had a specific scent, a mixture of high-quality paper, wood polish, and the faint, lingering aroma of expensive cigars from the adjacent lounge. It was a place where the clack-clack of the rails was muffled by extra layers of insulation in the floor. People didn't talk in the library car. They read. They wrote letters on stationery embossed with the railroad's golden crest, writing home from the trail of the Super Chief. The act of writing on a moving train required a certain rhythm. You waited for the long, straight stretches of track to form your letters, and you paused during the switches. It was a slow, deliberate form of communication that matched the steady pace of the journey.
While the western lines were about scale and distance, the railroads of the American South, like the Southern Crescent, were about texture and atmosphere. Traveling through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, the train moved through a world of deep greens and liquid shadows. The tracks often ran through swampy lowlands where the Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like gray, tattered lace. The air in the South was heavy and humid. When the train stopped at a small station in South Carolina at dusk, the smell of damp earth, blooming magnolia, and wood smoke would drift through the open vestibule doors. The sounds were different too. The frantic chirping of cicadas and the deep rhythmic croak of bullfrogs would compete with the idling hum of the locomotive. In these parts of the country, the railroad felt like it was part of the forest itself. The tracks were often overgrown with kudzu vines, and the train seemed to push through the foliage like a slow-moving riverboat. It was a journey through a slower time, where the heat of the day dictated the pace of life, and the train was the only thing that moved with a sense of purpose through the sleepy, sun-drenched landscape. By the late 1950s, the big boy locomotives and the high-speed Hudsons were being retired. The transition to diesel was almost complete. The end of the steam era was a quiet, almost mournful time in American history. These giant machines, which had built the nation, were being led to the scrapyards or placed in parks as silent statues.
The final runs of the great steam engines were attended by thousands of people who stood in silence along the tracks. They didn't come to cheer, they came to say goodbye to a sound. They wanted to hear the whistle one last time, that haunting multi-chime chord that seemed to carry the weight of the entire 19th century within it. As the last steam engine pulled into the yard, the fire was dropped, the steam was bled off, and for the first time in 100 years, the railroad yards became truly quiet. The huff and puff were gone, replaced by the steady, unvarying drone of the diesel. It was the end of the railroad's childhood, a transition from a breathing, temperamental machine to a reliable industrial tool. As the 1960s began, the American landscape started to change again. Parallel to many of the great rail lines, massive ribbons of gray concrete were being laid down. This was the Eisenhower interstate system. The sound of American travel was shifting from the click-clack of the rail to the whir of the rubber tire. The interstate brought a different kind of freedom, but it lacked the communal rhythm of the train. In a car, you were in your own small world. On a train, you were part of a moving village. From the window of a train in 1965, you could see the families in their station wagons, packed with luggage, heading out on the great American road trip. The railroad was no longer the only way to see the country, and as a result, it became even more of a sanctuary. The trains became less crowded, the service even more attentive, and the journey became a choice made by those who valued the slow over the fast. We return to the interior of the car as the sun sets over the Great Plains. The evening ritual on a long-distance American train is perhaps the most calming tradition in travel history. Around 8 p.m., the porter would move through the sleeping cars. If you were in a roomette, he would turn a large handle and the wall would seemingly disappear, transforming into a perfectly made bed with crisp white sheets and a heavy wool blanket. He would place a small carafe of ice water in the holder and a single chocolate on the pillow. He would check the heavy window latch to ensure no draft would disturb your sleep. There is a profound sense of security in a train compartment at night. The walls are solid, the door is locked, and the world is rushing by just inches away, yet you are completely encased in a small, warm room. You can hear the singing of the wind against the stainless steel fluting of the car's exterior. It is a high-pitched musical note that lulls you into a state of deep relaxation. As you lie there, the train might slow down as it enters a freight yard. You hear the distant muffled clank of cars being coupled and the low melodic call of a yardmaster's whistle. These are the sounds of a world that never sleeps, a world that is constantly working to keep the lines open, while you, the traveler, are free to drift off into a dreamless sleep, rocked by the gentle swaying motion of the iron rails.
By 1971, the great private railroads of America, the giants like the Pennsylvania, the New York Central, and the Santa Fe, were tired. The rise of the jet engine and the sprawling interstate highway system had taken the hurry out of the rails. On May 1st, 1971, a new entity was born to save the passenger train, Amtrak. The early days were known as the Rainbow Era, because Amtrak inherited cars from dozens of different railroads. A single train might have a silver car from the Burlington, a purple car from the Atlantic coastline, and a bright yellow car from the Union Pacific.
To see one of these trains passing through the autumn woods of Vermont or the rolling hills of Virginia was like watching a moving collage of American history. It was a slow, colorful transition. The focus shifted from being a transportation necessity to being a national treasure. The pace slowed down even more. The schedules became suggestions, and the journey itself became the primary reason to buy a ticket. It was the beginning of the slow travel movement before the term even existed. One of the most iconic sounds of the American landscape is the railroad crossing signal. Even in the most remote corners of the Midwest, where the cornfields stretch to the edge of the world, you will find these silent sentinels. As a train approaches, the warning begins. First, the rhythmic, metallic ding, ding, ding of the bell. It is a simple, high-pitched sound that cuts through the wind. Then the flashing red lights, two glowing orbs that pulse in the twilight. Finally, the long white and red striped gate descends with a soft hydraulic hiss. For a driver waiting at the gate, this is a forced moment of meditation. You cannot rush the train. You sit in your car, the engine idling, and watch the cars pass by. Thump, 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 thump. You see the names on the freight cars: BNSF, Norfolk Southern, CSX, Canadian National. They are like a vocabulary of the continent. The wind kicked up by the passing train shakes your car gently, and then, as quickly as it began, the last car passes. The bell stops, the gate rises, and the silence that follows is deeper than the silence before. It is a reminder that a great force has just moved through your world, and now the road is yours again. There is perhaps no more peaceful route in the United States than the path of the Southwest Chief, which runs from Chicago to Los Angeles. The most magical segment occurs as the train crosses the Mojave Desert at night. In the daytime, the Mojave is a harsh world of sun-bleached rock and shimmering heat, but at night, under a full moon, it transforms into a silver kingdom. The Joshua trees stand like jagged statues against the horizon. The sand reflects the moonlight, making the desert floor look like a calm, frozen sea. Inside the train, the lights are dimmed. Passengers in the observation car sit in swivel chairs, staring out at the vastness. Because there are no cities for 100 miles, there is no light pollution. The stars are so thick they look like clouds. The train moves through this landscape with a steady, unhurried gait. The sound of the wheels on the desert track is different. It is a dry, crisp sound. Every now and then you might see the glowing eyes of a kit fox or a coyote standing near the tracks, watching the silver ghost pass by. It is a journey through a world that feels prehistoric, a place where time has no meaning, and the only thing that matters is the steady westward pull of the rails. Have you ever wondered why it is so easy to fall asleep on a train? It isn't just the comfortable seats, it is a matter of physics and biology. Railroads produce what scientists call pink noise. Unlike white noise, which is like the static of a radio, pink noise has a frequency that mimics the natural sounds of the world, like a heartbeat, or the rustling of leaves, or the sound of rain. The rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels occurs at a frequency of about 1 beat per second, which is very close to the resting heart rate of a human being. Furthermore, the sway of the train car is a low-frequency vibration. This lateral motion stimulates the vestibular system in your inner ear, the same system that was stimulated when you were rocked as a baby. When you combine the pink noise, the rhythmic heartbeat of the rails, and the gentle rocking of the car, your brain receives a powerful signal. You are safe. You are moving. You can rest. This is why the history of the railroad is, in many ways, a history of the best sleep Americans ever had. Not every railroad stayed busy. As the coal mines closed in West Virginia or the timber mills shut down in Oregon, thousands of miles of track were abandoned. These are the ghost tracks. There is perhaps no more peaceful route in the United States than an abandoned railroad line. Over time, the iron rails turn a deep earthy orange from rust. The wooden ties begin to soften, turning into a rich mulch where wildflowers and moss grow. In many parts of the U.S., these lines have been turned into rails-to-trails paths. You can walk or bike for miles along an old railroad grade. Because trains cannot climb steep hills, these paths are always flat and gentle. They cut through the center of forests and over high stone trestles that cars can never reach. When you walk on an old railroad bed, you can still feel the ghost of the machine. You see the deep cuts through the hillsides where men once blasted through rock. You see the old mile markers leaning at an angle, covered in ivy. It is a place where the industrial world has surrendered to the natural world, and the result is a corridor of absolute quiet. In the modern Amtrak era, the heart of the train is the sightseer lounge. This is a double-decker car with windows that wrap up into the ceiling. Unlike an airplane, where everyone sits in silence with their headphones on, the lounge car is a social space, but a quiet one. People sit with their laptops, their journals, or a deck of cards. A college student might be reading a textbook while an elderly veteran tells a story about a trip he took in 1952. The background music to these conversations is the sound of the scenery. As the train passes through a tunnel in the Rockies, the car goes dark, and everyone falls silent, listening to the roar of the engine echoing off the tunnel walls. When the train emerges into a sunlit valley, there is a collective "ah" from the passengers. It is one of the few places in American life where strangers still talk to each other without a screen between them. The shared experience of the landscape creates a quiet bond. You are all, for a few days, residents of the same moving village.
If you ever find yourself in a city like North Platte, Nebraska, you will see the Bailey Yard, the largest railroad yard in the world. From a distance, it looks like chaos, but it is actually a masterpiece of slow-motion logic. This is where trains are built. A long freight train comes in, and the cars are separated based on where they are going. The most peaceful way they do this is via a hump. A locomotive pushes a long line of cars up a small artificial hill, the hump. At the top, a worker uncouples a single car. Gravity then takes over. The car rolls down the other side of the hill, silent and unpowered, gliding through a series of automated switches that guide it onto the correct track. There is something deeply satisfying at watching a 50-ton steel car roll silently through a yard, guided only by gravity and precision engineering. It eventually meets its new train with a soft metallic clink.
One by one, the cars find their places like pieces of a giant iron puzzle. By morning, a new train is formed, ready to carry grain to the coast or lumber to the desert. We have traveled from the first hand-drilled tunnels of the 1860s to the high-tech, gravity-fed yards of today. The technology has changed. The engines are quieter, and the gold spikes have been replaced by fiber-optic sensors. But the soul of the American railroad remains the same. It is the thread that holds the vast sprawling cloth of the continent together. It is a reminder that distance is something to be respected, not just overcome. As the sun sets on our story, imagine you are standing on a lonely platform in a small town in Iowa. The air is cool and smells of harvested corn. The sky is a deep, bruised purple. In the distance, you see a single bright white eye, the headlight of a locomotive. You feel the ground begin to hum before you hear the engine. Then comes the low, mournful call of the horn. Long, long, short, long, the universal signal for a crossing. The train glides past, a blur of silver and light, a moving city of dreams. And as the red taillights fade into the darkness, the click-clack grows fainter and fainter, until it is just a whisper, and then finally it returns to the silence from which it began. The rails are still there, cold and silver in the moonlight, waiting for the next rhythm to wake them up. While the passengers sleep and the freight moves, there is a hidden army that works in the deep hours of the night to ensure the iron highway remains perfect. This is the maintenance of way, MO. Imagine a group of men and machines moving slowly along a stretch of track in rural Montana. The air is so cold you can see your breath, and the only light comes from the powerful floodlights mounted on a yellow speeder car. The work they do is a masterpiece of micro-measurements. Railroad tracks are not static. Because of the weight of the trains and the expansion caused by the sun, the rails creep and kink. The mow crews use a machine called a tamper. This machine doesn't look like much, but its function is incredibly soothing to watch. It has metal fingers that reach deep into the stone ballast and vibrate at a specific frequency to pack the rocks tightly under the wooden ties. The sound of a tamper is a rhythmic, low-frequency thump, vibe, thump, vibe. It levels the track to within a fraction of an inch. If the track is off by even a few millimeters, the ride quality for the passenger changes. The mow crew's entire existence is dedicated to the pursuit of the smooth ride. They are the reason you can balance a cup of coffee on a table at 60 miles per hour without spilling a drop. Their work is invisible, their presence is fleeting, but their impact is felt in every mile of silent, steady gliding. In the history of American engineering, few things are as breathtaking and as quiet as the wooden trestle. These are the sprawling skeletal bridges that span deep canyons where stone and steel were too heavy to carry. The most famous of these is the Goat Canyon Trestle in the Carrizo Gorge of California. It is a massive structure made entirely of redwood timber. standing 186 feet high and over 600 feet long. It is the largest wooden trestle in the world. There is a unique acoustic quality to a wooden bridge. When a train moves across it, the wood doesn't ring like steel. It groans. It is a deep, organic sound, a symphony of ancient redwood fibers compressing and expanding under the weight. In the dry desert air, the wood has been preserved for decades. If you stand beneath the trestle, when no train is coming, you can hear the wind whistling through the thousands of vertical beams. It sounds like a giant harp played by the desert itself. It is a monument to a time when we built with the earth to cross the earth, a silent skeleton of progress standing in a canyon where the only other residents are golden eagles and bighorn sheep. For over 100 years, every American train ended with a caboose. Usually painted bright red, it was the train's back porch. It was a tiny house on wheels where the conductor and the brakeman lived, cooked, and watched the train ahead of them. The interior of a caboose was a marvel of cozy efficiency. It had a small coal-burning stove for warmth and for making railroad coffee, which was traditionally strong enough to wake the dead. There were bunks for sleeping and a cupola, a small raised window on the roof where the crew could sit and watch for smoke from hot boxes, overheating axles on the cars ahead. The caboose provided a sense of closure to the train. When it passed a crossing, the children waving from the side of the road knew the train was finished. But by the 1980s, technology replaced the caboose with a small electronic device called an EOT, end of train device. The disappearance of the caboose made the American railroad quieter. The back porch chatter was gone. The smell of bracken frying on a coal stove at 40 miles per hour became a memory. Today, the EOT sits on the last coupler, blinking its red light into the darkness, a silent digital eye that replaced a century of human companionship.
In the high passes of the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountains, winter doesn't just bring snow, it brings an ocean of white that can swallow a locomotive whole. To fight this, the railroads developed the rotary snowplow. This is not your average snowplow. It is a giant circular set of blades, often 12 feet in diameter, mounted on the front of a specialized car. When it encounters a drift of snow 40 feet high, it doesn't push it, it eats it. The blades spin at high speed, grinding the frozen snow into a fine powder and shooting it out of a chute hundreds of feet away from the tracks. The sound of a rotary plow in action is a low, powerful roar, whoosh. But the most fascinating part is the after. Once the rotary has passed through a deep mountain cut, it leaves behind perfectly vertical walls of snow, sometimes 20 feet high on either side of the track. It creates a snow tunnel. When the next passenger train passes through this cut, the world goes completely silent. The white walls absorb every vibration. For a few moments, the passengers are traveling through a hall of frozen marble, a silent white sanctuary carved out of the storm. Across the United States, there is a subculture of people known as rail fans or foamers.
They are individuals who will sit for hours at a lonely crossing in Ohio or a bridge in Pennsylvania just to watch a train go by. To the outsider, this seems boring, but to the rail fan, it is a form of meditation. They are students of the consist, the specific order and type of cars in a train. They listen for the prime mover, the diesel engine, and can tell just by the sound whether it is a GE Evolution series or an EMD SD70 AC. There is a peace in this hobby. It requires a total disconnection from the digital world. You have to be patient. You have to listen to the wind. You have to wait for the distant shimmer of the rails that signals an approaching locomotive. When the train finally arrives, it is a sensory explosion, the smell of diesel exhaust, the heat radiating from the brakes, the vibration in the soles of your boots, and then as it fades into the distance, you are left with a profound sense of the flow. The world is moving, goods are being delivered, the rhythm of the nation continues, and you were there to witness one small pulse of its heartbeat. If you have a radio scanner in a town like Chicago or Kansas City, you can listen to the language of the yard. This is a specialized technical dialect of American English that has remained unchanged for decades. UP 844, you've got a clear signal on the lead. Bring him down to track 4, over. Roger that, Yardmaster. Dropping 3 units, holding the manifest, out. The voices are always calm. In the railroad world, excitement is a sign of danger. A good engineer or yardmaster speaks in a low, steady drone. They use shorthand terms. A shanty is a small office, a reefer is a refrigerated car, and a highball means you are clear to go full speed. Listening to this chatter at night is like listening to a secret society. It is the sound of thousands of tons of steel being moved with the precision of a chess game. Every voice is a link in a chain that stretches across the continent. It is a verbal architecture of safety and efficiency played out over the static of the airwaves. Every railroad had a symbol, a mascot that represented its soul. For the Great Northern Railway, which ran through the northernmost states, it was Rocky, the mountain goat. The goat represented the railroad's ability to climb where others couldn't. The Great Northern was the empire builder, pushing through the jagged peaks of what is now Glacier National Park. There is a specific beauty to this northern route. In the winter, the tracks run through forests of ghost trees, pines so heavily encrusted with ice and snow that they look like white statues. The train, painted in Big Sky blue or Empire Builder orange, would cut through this monochromatic world like a vibrant ribbon. The history of this line is the history of the Great Lodge. The railroad built massive timber hotels like the Many Glacier Hotel to encourage tourists to see the American Alps. These lodges were designed to feel like the trains, massive, wooden, and quiet. They had great rooms with fireplaces so large you could stand inside them. The crackle of the logs in the lodge was the only sound that could compete with the distant whistle of the Empire Builder as it pulled into the station down the hill. Why do we stare out of train windows? In a car, we look at the road. In a plane, we look at the clouds. But on a train, we look at the backside of America. The railroad doesn't follow the highways. It follows the river valleys and the industrial corridors. When you look out a train window, you see the forgotten parts of the country, the rusted-out factories of the Rust Belt, the secret swimming holes of rural Missouri, the backyards of houses where laundry is hanging on the line. It is a voyeuristic history. You are seeing the country without its makeup on. You see the graffiti on the brick walls, the old chew mail pouch tobacco signs painted on barns, and the way the forest slowly swallows up abandoned farmhouses. This visual flow creates an alpha wave state in the brain, a state of relaxed alertness. It is why people find themselves spacing out on a train, falling into a deep philosophical reverie. You aren't just traveling through space, you are traveling through the collective memory of the United States.
While we have spent much of our journey looking at the rails and the sky, there is a secret history buried just 3 feet beneath the wooden ties. It is a history of light and glass. In the 1980s, the railroad companies realized they held the most valuable asset in the modern world, a continuous, unbroken path from one ocean to the other. They began to lay fiber optic cables along their right-of-way. Today, as you sit on a train in the middle of a silent, empty desert in Nevada, billions of bits of data are screaming beneath you at the speed of light. The emails, the videos, the bank transfers of the nation follow the exact same path that the steam engines blazed in 1869. The iron horse has become the glass horse. There is a strange modern peace in this realization. Even in the most remote wilderness, where there are no roads and no cell towers, the ground beneath the tracks is alive with the silent conversation of the continent. It is a dual history, the heavy physical movement of coal and grain above, and the weightless, invisible movement of information below. Both are governed by the same geography, the same curves, and the same quiet, steady determination to connect one side of the world to the other. To experience the true boring history of the rails, one must visit the Cascade Tunnel in Washington State. At nearly 8 miles long, it is a straight, dark needle driven through the heart of the Cascade Range. When a train enters the tunnel, the world changes. The bright greens of the Pacific Northwest are replaced by a darkness so absolute it feels heavy. The air becomes cool and damp, smelling of ancient stone and engine oil. Inside the tunnel, there is no wind, only the sound of the train's own breath. The locomotives create a piston effect, pushing a massive wall of air ahead of them. At the eastern end of the tunnel, there are massive white doors that remain closed until the train is just a few feet away. Huge fans, as tall as a house, roar to life to clear the exhaust from the tunnel. But once the train leaves and the fans stop, the tunnel returns to a state of profound subterranean silence. If you were to stand in the middle of that 8-mile tube, you would hear the earth itself. You would hear the slow drip of mountain water through the concrete lining, plink, plink, and the low tectonic groan of the mountain settling over the void. It is a place where time stands still, a cathedral of shadow that remains unchanged since it was finished in 1929. In 2019, something impossible happened.
A ghost from the 1940s was brought back to life. This was the Union Pacific Big Boy number 4014, the largest steam engine ever built. For 60 years, this machine had been a silent statue in a park. But after years of quiet, meticulous work by a small team of engineers in Wyoming, the fire was lit once again. To see the Big Boy move is to see a mountain in motion. It is 132 feet long and weighs 1.2 million pounds. But the most astonishing thing about it is how quiet it is at high speeds. Unlike the frantic chuffing of smaller engines, the Big Boy has a deep, rhythmic roll. It sounds like the earth itself is purring. When it travels across the American West today, people line the tracks for miles. They stand in silence as the giant passes. The scent it leaves behind, a mixture of coal smoke, hot grease, and steam, is a scent memory that connects modern Americans to their great-grandparents. It is a living piece of history, a reminder that we once built things so large and so beautiful that they could command the silence of an entire horizon. In New York City, there is a bridge that most people never see, yet it is one of the most important structures in the world, the Hell Gate Bridge. Built in 1916, its massive steel arch was so perfectly engineered that it served as the model for the Sydney Harbour Bridge in Australia. The name Hell Gate comes from the dangerous, swirling waters of the East River below, but on the bridge itself, everything is orderly and calm. The bridge was built to last 1,000 years. If humans were to disappear tomorrow, the Hell Gate Bridge would be one of the last structures standing in New York. There is a deep architectural peace in its design. The heavy granite towers anchor the steel arch with a sense of permanence that is rare in our disposable world. When the Acela high-speed train crosses the Hell Gate at night, the passengers see the shimmering lights of Manhattan to the south and the dark, quiet reaches of the Bronx to the north. The bridge doesn't shake, it doesn't vibrate. It holds the train in a firm steel embrace, a silent witness to a century of New Yorkers moving toward their futures. One of the reasons modern trains are so much quieter than the trains of the past is a process called continuous welded rail. In the old days, the rails were 30 feet long and bolted together. The gap between them caused that famous click-clack sound. But today, the rails are welded together into ribbons of steel that are miles long. The process of joining them is a beautiful, violent, and ultimately quiet piece of chemistry called thermite welding. A ceramic mold is placed around the gap between two rails. A mixture of iron oxide and aluminum powder is ignited. It burns at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a liquid steel that flows into the gap, melting the two rails into one. Once the weld is ground smooth, the seam disappears. The rail becomes a single, unbroken mirror of steel. When the wheels of a train pass over a weld, there is no sound, no bump, no click, just a continuous musical hum. This smooth metallurgy is the secret behind the rail lullaby. It turned the jagged rhythm of the 19th century into the smooth, liquid flow of the 21st. In the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, there are places where the railroad is the only flat land for 50 miles. Here, The tracks follow the winding path of the New River, cutting through ancient canyons of sandstone and hemlock. The night shift engineers on this route talk about the hole in the wall, the deep, dark valleys where the moonlight never reaches the tracks. In these places, the locomotive's headlight is the only light in the world. As the train moves through the fog-heavy woods, the headlight catches the eyes of deer, foxes, and the occasional black bear. They stand at the edge of the woods, frozen by the light, watching the iron monster glide past. The engineers in these mountains develop a sixth sense. They can feel the condition of the track through their seat. They know every curve, every bridge, and every whistling post by the way the engine leans. It is a slow, intimate relationship with the geography of the East. The hole in the wall is not a place to be feared. It is a place of deep, dark sanctuary where the rest of the world's noise is blocked out by 1 billion tons of Appalachian stone.
We often overlook the humble coal hopper, but there is a structural beauty in a train consisting of 150 identical cars. When you see a coal train sitting in a siding in Wyoming, waiting for a faster passenger train to pass, you are looking at a masterpiece of gravity. Each car is shaped like a funnel, designed to be loaded in seconds and unloaded just as fast. When the train is stationary, it creates a steel wall across the landscape. If you walk beside a stopped coal train, the air is still. The massive cars block the wind. You can hear the thermal contraction of the metal, a series of high-pitched pings that sound like tiny hammers. There is a sense of potential energy in a stopped train. It is 100,000 tons of carbon waiting to be moved. When the signal finally turns green and the air brakes release with a long, satisfying psss, the train begins to move one car at a time. The slack is taken up. Clank, 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 clank. A sound that travels down the line like the falling row of dominoes. And then the silence returns as the heavy wall of steel glides slowly away. Sometimes, because of heat or construction, the railroad issues a slow order. This means a train that usually goes 60 miles per hour must drop down to 10. For the passengers, this is an accidental gift. At 10 miles per hour, the railroad becomes a walking tour. You can see the individual pebbles in the ballast. You can see the turtles sunning themselves on logs in the ditches. You can see the rust patterns on the old telegraph poles. In a world that is obsessed with high-speed rail, the slow order is a reminder of the value of the intermediate space. It forces us to look at the boring history of the ditch, the weed, and the fence post. It is in these moments of forced slowness that we truly see America, not as a map of cities, but as a continuous, beautiful, and often lonely landscape that exists in the in-between. If there is one train in America that captures the spirit of the long exhale, it is the Coast Starlight. Running from Seattle down to Los Angeles, it follows a path that seems impossible for a heavy machine. The most hypnotic segment occurs between San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara. Here the tracks leave the roads behind and hug the very edge of the Pacific cliffs. In some places there is nothing between the train and the blue horizon but a few feet of salt-crusted grass. As you sit in the sightseer lounge, the ocean dominates your vision.
You see the white foam of the waves crashing against the black volcanic rocks. You see the kelp forests swaying in the tide, and the occasional spout of a gray migrating whale. Because the train is so close to the water, the light inside the car changes. It becomes a cool, shimmering silver, reflected off the Pacific. The sound of the train is swallowed by the vastness of the ocean air. It is a journey of extreme verticality, the high cliffs to your left and the deep, silent water to your right. It is perhaps the only place in America where a 500-ton train feels as light and graceful as a seagull. In the early parts of our story, we spoke of the water towers as the lifeblood of the steam era. Today, most of them are gone, but their ghosts remain in the geography of the small towns they once served. A railroad water tower was a masterpiece of gravity. It didn't use pumps. It used a massive tank held high in the air to create the pressure needed to fill a locomotive's tender in seconds. They were built of cedar or cypress because those woods expand when wet, naturally sealing the joints. Today, if you look closely at the main street of many American towns, you will see a tall, lonely structure that looks like a giant wooden barrel on stilts. Many have been stripped of their spouts, their paint peeling under the prairie sun. There is a specific melancholy in a dry water tower. It is a monument to a thirst that no longer exists. But in many towns, these towers have become landmarks. They are the first thing a pilot sees from the air or a traveler sees from the highway. They stand as silent markers of where the iron horse used to stop to catch its breath, a reminder that the land was once measured not in miles, but in the distance between two drinks of water. Before the era of apps and digital screens, the railroad lived and breathed through the timetable. This was a small accordion-folded booklet printed on paper so thin it felt like silk. The timetable was a work of dense mathematical poetry. It was a grid of numbers, thousands of them, representing every stop, every junction, and every crossing. But if you knew how to read it, it told a story. It told you where the sun would be when you crossed the Mississippi. It told you which trains carried dining cars and which carried sleeping cars. There was a quiet ritual to checking the time. A passenger would pull the folded paper from their vest pocket, smooth it out on their knee, and run a finger down the columns. The font was always small and elegant, usually Baskerville or Caslin. The timetable gave the journey a sense of inevitable progress. Even if the train was late, the paper promised that the destination still existed, waiting for you at the end of a column of numbers. It was a physical anchor in a moving world, a piece of paper that turned the chaos of travel into an orderly march of minutes. In the modern Amtrak superliner, the roomette is a masterpiece of small space engineering. It is a private cabin designed for two people, but it is best experienced alone. The roomette is roughly the size of a large walk-in closet. It has two oversized chairs that face each other, a fold-down table, and a massive picture window. But the magic happens when you close the sliding glass door and pull the heavy blue curtain. Suddenly, you are in a private universe. The noise of the hallway vanishes. You are left with the view and the rhythm. The roomette is designed to be tactile. Every latch, every light switch, and every storage nook is within arm's reach. There is a small blue light in the ceiling for night travel. When you turn off the main lights and leave only the blue glow, the world outside the window becomes more vivid. You can see the moonlight on the snow or the silhouettes of the trees. You feel as though you are in a small, safe submarine cruising through an ocean of landscape. It is the ultimate boring history experience to sit in a perfectly quiet 6 by 3 foot room while the history of the American continent slides past your shoulder.
While the giant railroads like the Union Pacific cover thousands of miles, America is also home to hundreds of short lines. These are railroads that might only be 10 or 20 miles long, serving a single grain elevator or a small paper mill. Short lines move at a different pace. Their tracks are often laid with lighter rail, and the grass often grows up between the ties. The locomotives are usually older, hand-me-down models from the big railroads, painted in bright local covers. To watch a short-line train is to see railroading in miniature. They don't rush. They might spend an hour switching 3 cars at a warehouse. The engineer and the conductor often know the name of every farmer whose land they cross. There is a profound peace in the short line. It is a reminder that the railroad isn't just about transcending distance, it's about connecting neighbors. The sound of a short line horn is often softer, more personal. It isn't a roar, it's a greeting. It is the sound of a small community staying connected to the world one slow carload at a time. Not all rails sound the same. The music of the railroad changes based on the weight of the steel. In the early days, rails weighed about 50 pounds per yard. They were thin and had a high-pitched ping when the wheels hit them. Today, mainline rails weigh 136 or even 141 pounds per yard. This is massive, dense steel. When a train moves over 141-pound rail, the sound is deep and tubular. It vibrates in the low frequency range below the level of human speech. This is why a modern freight train can sometimes sneak up on you. The sound is so low that it feels more like a change in air pressure than a noise. This heavy steel acts as a heat sink. In the summer, it stays cool longer than the air. In the winter, it holds the frost. If you touch a piece of heavy rail on a quiet morning, it feels as solid as the bedrock of the earth itself. It is the physical definition of stability. Knowing that you are riding on millions of tons of this heavy, silent steel is what allows the passenger to close their eyes and trust the journey completely. Every railroad journey eventually reaches its terminus, the end of the line. In the great cities, the tracks don't just stop, they fan out into a massive stub-end terminal. The final station has a unique emotional weight. It is a place of arrival, but also of stillness. When the train pulls into the bumping post at the end of the track, the journey's energy is finally spent. The air brakes give one last long sigh. The engine is shut down. In terminals like Los Angeles Union Station or Washington Union Station, the terminus is a place of grand echoes. The passengers disappear into the city, and for a few hours the train sits empty on the platform. The cleaners move through the cars, the mechanics check the wheels, and the sun moves across the high, vaulted ceilings of the concourse. This pause at the end of the line is a crucial part of the railroad's history. It is the moment where the moving story of the tracks meets the stationary story of the city. It is the balance between the going and the being. In the golden age of American rail travel, the most important person on the train was often the one you heard the least. This was the Pullman porter. The porter was a master of the soft touch. He moved through the sleeping car with a grace that was almost supernatural. While the passengers slept, The porter was awake in his small jump seat at the end of the car, bathed in the soft amber glow of a single lamp. His night was a series of quiet, rhythmic rituals. One of the most famous was the shoe shine. Passengers would place their scuffed leather boots or Oxfords in a small wooden locker called a monocle that opened both to the room and the hallway. The porter would retrieve them, take them to his station, and begin the slow, steady work of applying polish. The sound of the brush on leather, shush, 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 was a faint, comforting percussion that merged with the hum of the wheels. He would buff them until they shone like mirrors, then return them to the locker so that when the passenger woke in a new state, their shoes would be as fresh as the morning dew. The porter's uniform was always crisp, his white gloves a symbol of absolute cleanliness. He was the guardian of the quiet zone. If a door creaked, he oiled it. If a window rattled, he wedged a small piece of felt into the frame. He was the architect of sleep, ensuring that the human experience inside the car was as smooth as the steel rails outside. In the busy junctions of the East Coast, where tracks from 4 different directions would meet, stood the signal tower. This was a tall, narrow building with windows on all 4 sides, looking out over a sea of iron switches. Inside the tower was a mechanical interlocking machine. This was a row of massive brass and iron levers, sometimes 50 or 60 in a row, painted in bright colors, red for signals, black for switches, yellow for distant warnings. The leverman lived a life of heavy, rhythmic logic. To clear a path for the 20th Century Limited, he would have to pull a specific sequence of levers. The sound was a series of deep, metallic clunks that echoed through the wooden floor. Clunk, thud, clunk, thud. Below the floor, a complex web of iron rods and rocker arms would stretch out for hundreds of yards, physically moving the heavy steel rails into position. There were no computers, no electrical sensors, just the physical strength of the leverman and the mathematical perfection of the machine. At night, the signal tower was a beacon of order. The leverman would sit in the dark, watching the red and green lights of the yard. When a train passed, the tower would shake gently, and the smell of hot oil and steam would drift up through the floorboards. It was a place of extreme responsibility, managed with extreme quiet. A single mistake could lead to chaos, but in the hands of a master leverman, the movement of 1,000 trains was as peaceful as a game of chess played in a library. As you travel through the breadbasket of America, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, the horizon is punctuated by massive white towers. These are the grain elevators, often called the cathedrals of the plains. For the railroad, the grain elevator is the reason for existence. These structures are built directly alongside the tracks. They are made of thick, reinforced concrete, designed to hold millions of bushels of wheat, corn, and soy. There is a specific atmosphere around a country grain elevator. The air always smells sweet, a mixture of dry grain dust and the scent of the nearby fields. When a grain extra train arrives, it moves at a walking pace. The engine idles with a low guttural thrum, thrum, thrum that vibrates the very ground. The loading process is a waterfall of gold. The spout is lowered into the top of a hopper car, and thousands of pounds of grain rush down with a sound like heavy rain hitting a tin roof. Once the car is full, the train inches forward to the next one. This process can take all day. To the observer, it is a lesson in the abundance of the earth. It is a slow, dusty, and deeply satisfying display of the continent's wealth being gathered and prepared for its long journey to the coast. To the average person, a railroad track looks like a straight line, but to an engineer, it is a profile. Every engineer carries a track chart, a long, narrow roll of paper that shows the hidden geography of the line. The chart shows the grade, the steepness of the hills. A 1% grade means the track rises 1 foot for every 100 feet of distance. That might sound like nothing, but for a 10,000-ton train, it is a mountain. The chart also shows the curvature. Curves are measured in degrees. A 4-degree curve is a gentle sweep. A 10-degree curve is a sharp, squealing turn where the wheels hunt against the rail. Studying a track chart is like reading the music of the landscape. It shows where the engineer must open the throttle to gain momentum and where he must lap the brakes to maintain control. It is a document of balance. When you are a passenger and you feel the train gently slow down before a curve or hum with extra power as it hits a ruling grade, you are feeling the engineer's interpretation of the track chart. It is a silent, invisible dance between the machine and the mathematics of the earth. Not all freight trains are slow. In the railroad world, there is the hot shot, a high-priority train carrying time-sensitive goods like fruit from California or auto parts from Detroit. The hot shot has rights of track over everything else. If you are on a passenger train and you pull onto a siding, a secondary track, and wait for 20 minutes, it is likely because a hot shot is coming through. Seeing a hot shot pass at 2 a.m. in the middle of the desert is a spiritual experience. First, you see the searchlight on the horizon, a finger of white light cutting through the sagebrush. Then comes the sound, not a huffing, but a high-speed aerodynamic roar. The train passes in a blur of silver and black. You see the sparks from the wheels and the glowing orange of the brake shoes. The wind it creates is a physical force that pulls at the grass and shakes the signs. And then, in 90 seconds, it is gone. The red markers on the last car disappear into the darkness, and the desert returns to its ancient, undisturbed silence. The hot shot is the pulse of American commerce, fast, efficient, and hauntingly beautiful in its single-minded focus. We return briefly to the roundhouse, but this time we look at the turntable. This is the massive pivoting bridge that sits at the center of the yard. The turntable is a masterpiece of balanced weight. Even though it might be carrying a 200-ton locomotive, it is so perfectly balanced on its center kingpin that a single electric motor, no larger than the one in a washing machine, can spin the entire thing. There is a moment of weightless silence when the engine is perfectly centered on the turntable. For a few seconds, the massive machine is disconnected from the rest of the world. It floats. As it rotates, the wheels of the turntable bridge make a soft, rhythmic clink, clink, clink on the circular rail below. In the winter, the pit of the turntable often fills with steam from the engines, creating a white, swirling cloud. The engine emerges from this mist like a ghost, turning slowly until it faces its new direction. It is the reset of the railroad, the moment where the journey ends and the preparation for the next one begins. In the early 20th century, the tracks were maintained by crews known as Gandhi dancers. The name came from the Gandhi Manufacturing Company and the dance the men performed to move the heavy rails. The Gandhi dancers worked in perfect rhythmic synchronization. To move a section of rail that weighed 2 tons, they used long iron bars. A caller would sing a chant, a
a slow melodic work song, and on the final beat of the song, every man would lean into his bar at the exact same moment. I've been working on the railroad. The was the sound of 20 men exerting their collective strength. This rhythmic coordination was the only way to move the heavy iron before the invention of hydraulic machines. The sound of a Gandhi dancer crew was a mixture of singing and the metallic clink of the bars hitting the rail. It was a human rhythm, a labor of breath and muscle that kept the iron highway straight and true. Today, the Gandhi dancers are gone, replaced by yellow machines. But if you look at the old hand-hewn cuttings through the hills of Kentucky or Tennessee, you can still feel the echo of their songs in the quiet of the woods. As our journey nears its 15,000-word mark, we imagine a train reaching the end of its run in a quiet coastal town like Portland, Maine, or San Diego, California. The engineer pulls the independent brake. The train comes to a final gentle halt. One by one, the lights in the passenger cars are turned off. The heavy vestibule doors are locked. The engine remains idling for a few minutes. Diesel engines are rarely turned off completely because they take so long to warm up. Instead, they drop into a low idle, a steady heartbeat like thump, thump, thump. If you stand on the platform after everyone has left, you realize that the train is talking. You hear the cooling metal of the exhaust manifolds contracting, tink, tick, tink. You hear the soft hiss of the air dryer on the brake system. You hear the wind whistling through the empty observation deck. The train is no longer a machine of motion. It is a monument of rest. It has crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers. It has carried the dreams, the letters, and the wealth of a nation. And now, in the cool, salt-scented air of the night, it finally rests, its silver skin reflecting the stars, waiting for the sun to rise and the grand silence to be broken once again by the first whistle of the morning. In the early years of the 20th century, the dining car was not just a place to eat, but a theater of American abundance. To step from the swaying vestibule into the diner was to leave the rugged landscape of the frontier and enter a room that felt like a high-end club in Manhattan. The tables were heavy mahogany, bolted to the floor to resist the centrifugal force of the curves. They were draped in railroad linen, a fabric so thick and starched it felt like soft parchment. The silver was real, heavy in the hand, each fork and spoon engraved with the name of the line, Pennsylvania Railroad or Great Northern. One of the most surprising pieces of history was the railroad orange. Before the transcontinental lines, an orange was a luxury in the East, something only found at the bottom of a Christmas stocking. But with the advent of the reefer, refrigerator car, the railroads began moving citrus from California and Florida across the snowy plains. Imagine a passenger in 1920 sitting in a heated dining car while a blizzard rages outside in Wyoming. On the table sits a perfectly bright, sun-kissed orange, its skin smelling of a distant summer. The act of peeling that orange, the sharp, sweet scent filling the car while the world outside is a monochromatic white, was a miracle of logistics. It was the sound of the spoon hitting the grapefruit, the clink of the ice in the heavy crystal water glass, and the low, constant shh of the wheels. It was a sensory lullaby that made the vastness of the country feel manageable.
We must pause to look at the women who changed the West. Before Fred Harvey, eating along the tracks was a dangerous gamble with mystery meat and stale biscuits. Harvey changed this by hiring the Harvey Girls. These were young women from the East and Midwest recruited through newspapers with a simple promise. Young women of good character, attractive and intelligent, to go west as waitresses. They were the first female workforce in the American service industry to be treated with absolute respect. The Harvey Girls lived in Harvey houses under the strict supervision of a house mother. They wore white aprons so stiff they could almost stand up on their own. Their movement was a study in synchronized grace. In a busy station like Albuquerque or Dodge City, 100 passengers would disembark at once. Within minutes, the Harvey Girls would have them seated, their orders taken in a silent code of signals, and their first course served. The sound of a Harvey house was the sound of refined efficiency. The clatter of the plates was muffled by thick rugs. The girls spoke in low, polite tones. For a rough-edged cowboy or a weary miner, being served by a Harvey Girl was a reminder of the civilized world. It brought a quiet dignity to the dusty trails, proving that the railroad wasn't just moving people, it was moving a culture of kindness and order. As the 1950s turned into the 60s, many of the smaller branch lines were closed. The trains stopped coming, but the buildings remained. Across the American landscape today, there are thousands of these ghost depots. There is a specific hollow silence in an abandoned station. The high windows, once bright with the reflection of arrival, are now dusty or boarded up. If you manage to peek inside an old depot in rural Ohio or the high desert of Nevada, you see a world frozen in 1945. The ticket window is still there, its brass bars tarnished green by time. The long wooden benches, polished by the coats of 1 million travelers, sit in the shadows. The air inside smells of cold ash, old paper, and a faint lingering scent of the creosote that once coated the tracks outside. Outside, the tracks have often been pulled up. The right-of-way is now a path of weeds and wildflowers, but the station remains a pillar of memory. It was the place where soldiers said goodbye to their mothers, where brides arrived to start new lives, and where the news of the world first touched the town. Standing near an abandoned depot at twilight is a lesson in the boring history of change, the realization that time moves like a train, leaving these quiet monuments in its wake. In the modern era, the railroad has found a new voice in the Northeast Corridor between Washington, D.C. and Boston. This is the home of the Acela Express. The Acela doesn't chuff or roar, it whirs. It is a high-tech beast of electric motors and tilting technology. When the Acela hits its top speed of 150 miles per hour, the interior of the car is a low-frequency hum, like the interior of a pressurized jet. The most fascinating part of the Acela is the tilting. As it enters a sharp curve in Connecticut or Rhode Island, the entire body of the train leans into the turn, counteracting the force that would usually pull a passenger out of their seat. To the person inside, the horizon seems to tilt, while their coffee remains perfectly level in the cup. This is the mathematics of motion taken to its extreme. The train is constantly talking to itself. Sensors in the wheels are communicating with computers in the cab, adjusting the suspension 1,000 times a second. It is a quiet, digital ballet performed at incredible speeds.
It represents the quiet future of the rails, where the struggle between gravity and speed is solved with silent algorithms. Most of the time, we think of trains in terms of the cars we see, but the true boring history of modern America is the intermodal freight. If you are standing at a crossing in the middle of the night, you will see a train that seems to be composed of thousands of identical steel boxes. These are the shipping containers. They may have started their journey on a ship from Singapore, but now they're stacked too high on well cars, rushing towards a distribution center in Chicago or Memphis. There is a quiet power in the intermodal train. It is the reason the shelves of the stores are full. Inside those boxes are the clothes you wear, the electronics you use, and the parts for the car you drive. The train is a moving warehouse. The sound of an intermodal train is a steady, rhythmic whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Because the containers are heavy and the cars are long, the vibration is deep and consistent. Watching one of these 2-mile-long trains pass in the darkness is a reminder that while the world seems to move at the speed of the internet, it still relies on the physical, heavy, and quiet movement of steel on steel. As we reach the end of our 20,000-word journey, we must ask, why does the history of the railroad feel so peaceful? It is because the railroad represents the path. Unlike a car, which requires constant attention and steering, or a plane, which exists in a void, the train follows a predetermined physical line. It is a journey of surrender. Once you step onto the train, you are no longer in charge. You are a passenger in the truest sense. The railroad is the middle ground between the earth and the sky. It follows the rivers, it hugs the mountains, and it whispers through the forests. It is a history of humans trying to find a rhythm that matches the rhythm of the planet. As the sun sets on the iron rails, imagine you are back in that Pullman berth. The curtains are closed. The porter has turned down the sheets. The click-clack of the rails is a steady, ancient heartbeat. You aren't just moving across a country. You are moving through time. You are part of a 160-year-old story of steam, iron, silver, and stone. The whistle blows one last time, a long, fading note that echoes across the dark fields of America. The wheels turn, the wind sighs, and the world outside the window disappears into a soft velvet black. The journey is over, the tracks are clear, and the grand silence finally takes hold. If you drive through the valleys of West Virginia or the flatlands of Ohio, you will sometimes see a massive gray concrete structure standing over the tracks like a headless giant. This is a coaling tower. In the age of steam, these were the gas stations of the continent. They were built of reinforced concrete to withstand the immense weight of thousands of tons of coal. A train would pull directly underneath the tower's massive belly. A chute would lower, and with a heavy, muffled whoosh, the coal would cascade into the locomotive's tender. Today, these towers are too expensive to tear down and too sturdy to fall. They stand as silent monuments to the Black Diamond era. When you pass one on a foggy morning, it looks like an ancient castle. There is a profound stillness around them. The birds often nest in the upper chutes, and the wind whistles through the empty coal pockets. They are the Stonehenges of the American industrial age, monolithic, functional, and deeply, quietly permanent.
Every engineer has a signature whistle, but there is one signal that is the most haunting of all. The long, long, short long at a final crossing before the terminal. As we conclude this chapter of our journey, imagine a train in 1950 pulling into a small town in Vermont for the very last time. The line is being closed. The tracks will be pulled up next month. The engineer pulls the cord for a final, extra-long blast. It is a sound of farewell. It echoes off the brick walls of the general store and carries over the hills where the sheep are grazing. The train stops. The steam is bled off. The engineer climbs down, wipes his hands on a piece of oily cotton waste, and looks back at the iron path he has traveled for 40 years. The history of the railroad is a history of these individual goodbyes, the quiet moments when the fire goes out, the rails go cold, and the grand silence is finally perfectly complete. In the golden age of steam, before a locomotive could be tucked away in the roundhouse for the night, it had to visit the most humble yet essential part of the yard, the ash pit. Imagine a massive locomotive, its iron skin still radiating the heat of a 100-mile run, pulling over a deep concrete trench filled with water. The fireman would open the hopper at the bottom of the firebox, and the glowing red embers of spent coal would cascade down into the water. The sound was a spectacular, muffled hiss whoosh, a cloud of white steam rising into the cool evening air, smelling of sulfur and wet stone. It was the exhale of the machine. The ash pit was a place of transformation. The violent energy of the fire was extinguished, leaving behind a fine gray silt. There is a specific peace in this ritual, the cooling of the dragon. As the steam cleared, the locomotive felt lighter, its breathing slowed to a faint metallic tick, ready to be moved by the hostler to its final stall. You may have noticed a tall, slender tower in old railroad yards, often standing near the coaling station. This was the sand tower. To a modern observer, it looks like a simple silo, but to a railroad engineer, sand was as important as water or coal. Steel wheels on steel rails have very little friction. On a rainy day or a steep mountain grade, the wheels would simply spin in place, creating a shower of sparks but no movement. To solve this, every locomotive carried sand boxes, large domes on the top of the boiler. The sand had to be perfectly dry, sifted until it was as fine as powdered sugar. The sand tower was a masterpiece of gravity and air pressure. The sand would be blown to the top of the tower and then fed through long, flexible hoses into the locomotive. When you see a train starting a heavy load today, you can hear a soft hissing sound. That is the sander blowing a thin stream of grit directly on the rail in front of the wheels. It is the sound of grit and determination. It is a microscopic history of how 1 billion tiny grains of sand allow a 1,000,000-pound machine to climb a mountain. The sand tower remains a quiet sentinel of the yard, a reminder that the greatest machines in the world are ultimately dependent on the simplest elements of the earth. In the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, there is a place where the railroad does something physically impossible. To climb the steep grades, the engineers of the Pennsylvania Railroad designed the horseshoe curve, completed in 1854.
Instead of trying to go straight up the mountain, the tracks perform a massive 220-degree sweep around a valley. If you stand at the center of the curve, you can see the front of a long freight train on one side of the valley and the end of the same train on the other side, moving in the opposite direction. There is a profound rhythmic beauty to the horseshoe curve. Because the curve is so long and the grade is so steady, the locomotives develop a synchronized chant. The sound echoes off the surrounding hills, a deep, resonant thump-thump, thump-thump that sounds like a giant drum. At night, the curve is a ribbon of light. You see the glowing windows of the passenger cars or the flickering sparks from the freight brakes as they navigate the descent. It is a place where engineering meets the landscape in a perfect circular embrace. The horseshoe curve is a slow-motion marvel, a reminder that sometimes the best way to move forward is to lean into the curve. While the West had the vastness of the plains, the East had the stubbornness of the Appalachian Mountains. This led to the creation of the short tunnels, often called holes in the wall. Unlike the 8-mile tunnels, these were often only a few hundred feet long, hand-carved through solid limestone or shale. Passing through one in an open-windowed coach in the 1920s was a sensory experience. First, the temperature would drop by 20 degrees in a single second. The air would become damp and smell of moss and cold stone. Then the sound of the locomotive would intensify, the chuff echoing off the low ceiling with a violent rhythmic power. And then, just as quickly, you would burst back into the sunlight, the green trees of West Virginia or Kentucky rushing past. These tunnels were the punctuation marks of the journey. They were the moments where the train was swallowed by the earth and spat back out, a brief, cool sanctuary from the heat of the summer sun. Today, many of these old tunnels are abandoned, their entrances draped in ivy and ferns, standing as silent, dark doorways to a history that moved beneath the world. No history of the rails is complete without a touch of the spectral. Across the American West, there are legends of the ghost train. The legend usually involves a phantom locomotive that appears on abandoned tracks on moonless nights. But unlike a scary ghost story, the legend of the railroad ghost is one of peace. It is said you don't hear the engine, you only hear the singing of the rails, that high-pitched vibration that precedes a train, and then a soft white light passes by, smelling of ozone and old roses. In the 18th century, these stories were a way for railroaders to process the missing. Trains that were lost to avalanches or bridge washouts became part of the folklore of the eternal schedule. If you sit near a quiet stretch of track in the Colorado mountains today, when the wind is still and the stars are bright, it is easy to imagine that the great transcontinental is still running on a hidden frequency. It is a history of persistence, the idea that once a path is worn into the earth by the weight of iron, it remains there forever, a ghost of progress that refused to be forgotten.
Have you ever wondered how a perfectly straight piece of steel rail becomes a curve? This was the work of the rail bender. Before the era of massive factory machines, this was done by hand using a Jim Crow rail bender, a heavy iron screw press. A crew of men would move along a section of rail, applying the press and turning a massive handle. The sound was a slow, agonizing groan of complaining metal. Creak, groan, snap. The steel would resist, then slowly yield, taking on a permanent, graceful arc. It was a battle of human will against the molecular structure of iron. There was a specific science to this. If they bent it too much, the rail would snap. Too little, or the train would hunt or vibrate. The head Gandhi dancer would sight down the rail with one eye, checking the curve against a string line. It was a work of industrial art, the creation of a smooth, fluid path out of a rigid, stubborn material. Watching this was like watching a sculptor work with a 2-ton chisel. To conclude this section, we look at the social history inside the Pullman car. Travel in the 1930s was governed by a strict, quiet code of conduct. In a Pullman sleeper, loud conversation was forbidden after 9 p.m. People spoke in the train whisper, a low-frequency murmur that didn't travel over the partitions. The sound of a deck of cards being shuffled, the soft clink of a glass of ginger ale, and the rustle of the Saturday Evening Post were the only sounds in the lounge. There was a profound sense of shared privacy. You were in a room with 30 strangers, yet you were in your own world. When you climbed into your berth and the porter buttoned the heavy green curtain, you were in a sanctuary. The etiquette required that you respect the grand silence of the car. This social pressure created an atmosphere of extreme calm. It was a collective agreement to be still, to be quiet, and to let the motion of the train be the only thing that mattered. It was a time when Americans knew how to wait, how to listen, and how to find peace in the long, steady glide toward the horizon. We have spoken of the whistle as a signal, but we must understand it as an instrument. In the mid-20th century, the American steam whistle reached its peak of musical complexity with the multi-chime. A standard whistle was a single note, often harsh and piercing. But the great railroads, the Norfolk and Western, the Southern Pacific, and the Pennsylvania, commissioned whistles with 3, 5, or even 6 separate chambers. Each chamber was a different length, tuned to a specific musical interval. When the engineer pulled the lever, the steam rushed through all these chambers simultaneously, creating a rich, haunting chord. A passenger chime was often tuned to a major triad, sounding bright and welcoming like a pipe organ in a cathedral. A freight whistle was often deeper, a minor chord that sounded lonesome and powerful, carrying a weight of melancholy across the Appalachian valleys. In Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, stands a structure that feels as though it was transported from ancient Rome. This is the Starocca Viaduct, completed in 1848. It is a series of 17 massive stone arches stretching 1,000 feet across a deep valley. At a time when most bridges were built of wood and iron, the Starocca was built of solid, locally quarried stone. It was so expensive that it was called the 8th wonder of the world. But the brilliance of the stone was its silence. When a train passes over a steel bridge, there is a clatter and a ring, but when it passes over the Starocca, the stone absorbs the vibration. The sound is a low, muffled rumble like distant thunder. If you stand in the valley below on a quiet morning, the train appears to glide through the air, supported by these giant, silent arches. It is a monument to the idea that progress doesn't have to be loud. It can be heavy, stable, and as quiet as the hills themselves. In the heyday of the 20th Century Limited, New York Central's flagship train, the goal was not just speed, it was perfect stillness. This led to the legendary teacup test.
the roadmasters responsible for the track would place a full cup of tea on a table in the dining car. As the train traveled at 80 miles per hour through the curves of the Hudson River Valley, not a single drop was allowed to spill into the saucer. To achieve this, the tracks were maintained with a level of precision usually reserved for watchmaking. The super elevation, the way the track tilts in a curve, was calculated to the millimeter. The joints were ground smooth, and the ballast was packed until it was as firm as concrete. This quest for smoothness created a specific riding quality. It was a floating sensation, a feeling that you were being carried by a cloud rather than a machine. For the traveler, this was the ultimate luxury. You could write a letter, shave with a straight razor, or sleep without ever being jarred. The boring history of the railroad is the history of these thousands of men working in the dirt to ensure that a single cup of tea remained undisturbed. As steam began to fade, a new icon appeared on the Northeast Corridor, the NEGG-1 electric locomotive. Designed by the famed industrial stylist Raymond Loewy in 1934, it looked like something out of a futuristic dream. The NEGG-1 was a single, seamless shell of steel held together by rivets that were ground flat to create a smooth, aerodynamic skin. It was painted in Brunswick green with 5 delicate gold pinstripes that converged at the nose. The NEGG-1 didn't breathe fire or smoke. It ran on the silent power of electricity gathered from overhead wires. When an NEGG-1 pulled into a station, the only sound was the cooling fans, a low-pitched, futuristic whir. It could pull a 20-car train at 100 miles per hour with a grace that made steam engines look like clunky relics. It was the poetry of the machine age, a silent, powerful, and incredibly beautiful transition into the modern world.
Before the era of electric lights, the railroad used the semaphore to communicate. These were tall poles with wooden arms that would drop or rise to different angles. There was a rhythmic beauty to a line of semaphores. As a train moved down the track, the arms would clear ahead of it and drop behind it in a synchronized dance. Clack, thud. The arm would fall to the horizontal position, meaning stop. At night, a small kerosene lamp behind a colored glass spectacle would show red, green, or yellow. The signalman in his tower would pull a long lever, and you could hear the wires singing as they pulled the heavy wooden arm a mile away. It was a visual language, a way for the tracks to speak to the engineer without a single word being spoken. The semaphore was the punctuation of the journey, a series of mechanical pauses and breaths that kept the nation moving in perfect, quiet order. Part 100, the final stop, the sunset of the iron rails. We have reached the end of our 20,000-word journey through the Brand Silence. We have traveled from the first spike driven in the Utah dirt to the high-speed whispers of the modern age. Imagine, for one last moment, a small town in the American Midwest. It is 1955. The sun is setting, casting long golden shadows across the silver tracks. In the distance, the last steam-powered local is pulling away from the station. The sound is a slow, rhythmic fading. The chuff becomes a whisper. The whistle gives one last gentle chime that carries over the cornfields.
The smell of coal smoke lingers for a moment in the cooling air, then dissipates, leaving only the scent of the evening grass. The tracks remain. They are cold now, but they are still there, a silver network that changed the world. They taught us how to measure time. They taught us how to dream of distant places. And most importantly, they taught us the value of the steady glide, the idea that the most important part of any journey isn't how fast we get there, but the rhythm we find along the way. As the stars come out over the Great Plains, the iron rails reflect the moonlight, stretching out towards an infinite horizon. The station is dark, the signal is green, and the continent is at rest. The grand silence is finally complete.